The year is exactly 1887. The coordinate is Cleveland, Ohio. Charles Brush engineers a physical structure. It spans exactly 17 meters. It generates sufficient electron flow to operate his entire house for 20 years. No power bill. No centralized grid. No municipal permission. Atmospheric mass moves. A wheel rotates. A dynamo converts the kinetic energy. A basement of lead-acid batteries reaches maximum capacity. Then the hardware vanishes. There are exactly 6 wind machines, each engineered for one specific thermodynamic function, the extraction of usable electrical current from atmospheric pressure differentials. The reason you do not know them is not physics. The physics is absolute. The aerodynamic coefficients were valid in 1887. They are valid today. The reason is centralized capital. A localized mechanical structure that maintains battery equilibrium for 30 years is a commercial threat. It generates zero invoices. It cannot be disconnected from a control room exactly 200 miles away. That mechanism is a problem. Not for you. For the entities selling you continuous kilowatt hours. By the unit. Every month. Forever. I will detail the suppressed mechanical data. 6 specific turbine architectures. The engineers who manufactured the initial prototypes. The federal agency that systematically eradicated the sector in exactly 10 years. The absolute physical reality of which mechanism functions on your roof. Which one is a geometric failure? Remain focused. You will comprehend the applied mechanics of localized generation. You will possess superior data, superior to the salesman attempting to extract exactly $5,000 for an incompatible unit. We begin with the centralized utility deficit. The standard American house pays over exactly $1,700 a year for electricity. In specific geographic zones, the extraction rate is higher. The baseline does not remain static. It accelerates. A margin expansion here. A municipal surcharge there. A localized grid modernization fee applied without your direct authorization. This is the structural reality. You do not own the infrastructure. You lease the electron flow. Every single kilowatt hour. Every continuous 30-day cycle. For the absolute duration of your occupancy in that structure, you can achieve zero thermodynamic deficit on the mortgage. You can own every brick, every localized nail, every synthetic shingle. You will still transfer capital to a stranger to maintain optical illumination. Then atmospheric turbulence occurs. The centralized transmission line fails exactly 3 counties away. The thermal mass in your refrigerator equalizes. The localized water extraction pump ceases function. The lithium-ion cell in your phone registers exactly 4%. You stand in zero illumination. Inside a structure you own completely. You are utterly reliant on an external workforce to re-establish the continuous current. This is a deliberate commercial containment parameter. It is not the historical baseline. A specific chronological window existed, from exactly 1920 to 1945. Hundreds of thousands of American agricultural coordinates extracted their own localized current from the wind. They secured aerodynamic chargers to the roof structures. They maintained parallel banks of glass-cased lead-acid batteries in the subterranean levels. They achieved continuous optical illumination. They operated a radio transceiver, occasionally a mechanical agitator for textile sanitation. There was no centralized utility infrastructure within exactly 50 miles. They achieved absolute energetic independence. Then the mechanical parameter was altered. In the space of exactly 15 years, that localized generation was systematically disconnected. The applied physics did not expire. The rotating mechanisms did not fail the structural load limits. The manufacturing simply ceased. Centralized copper transmission lines generated superior capital accumulation over localized atmospheric extraction. 6 specific mechanical configurations survived. 6 distinct geometric structures to convert moving air mass into continuous electrical current. Each engineered for a specific structural foundation, a specific aerodynamic profile, a specific capital allocation. I will deconstruct the mechanical specifications of all 6. I will cite the precise manufacturing methodologies of the original engineers. You will possess the absolute physical parameters. Configuration 1. The tri-blade horizontal axis mechanism. The standard optical assumption. a rotating aerodynamic mass secured to a vertical lattice. It is oriented directly into the incoming pressure wave. This is the direct mechanical descendant of the Charles Brush installation. The Brush prototype utilized exactly 144-seater airfoils. The rotor diameter measured exactly 17 meters. The dynamo generated exactly 12 kilowatts. The total mass was exactly 80,000 pounds. It maintained localized equilibrium in his residential laboratory for exactly 2 decades. The individual who localized this physics for the standard consumer was Marcellus Jacobs. In the late 1920s, Marcellus and Joe Jacobs incorporated the Jacobs Wind Electric Company. They did not manufacture a novelty. They engineered a structural appliance. It possessed self-governing rotational mass. It withstood high-velocity atmospheric stress parameters of a prairie winter. The manufacturing tolerances were absolute. One specific unit was deployed to the Antarctic continent. It supplied electron flow for Admiral Richard Byrd's expedition in the 1930s. The physical record is documented. A secondary expedition team returned years later. The vertical structure remained intact. The aerodynamic mass maintained rotation. It survived severe structural burial at the absolute southern coordinate. The standard Jacobs unit generated exactly 1 to 3 kilowatts. It operated for exactly 30 to 40 years. It required minimal friction mitigation. It required minimal mechanical observation. Modern engineering replicates this exact rotational physics. Berge Wind Power in Norman, Oklahoma, incorporated in 1977, manufactures the identical mechanical premise. A tri-blade upwind configuration. The Berge XL variants are calibrated for exactly 10 kilowatts. They supply entire residential grids or agricultural zones. It remains the maximum aerodynamic efficiency shape currently engineered. This metric is critical. It approaches a strict thermodynamic ceiling. The mathematics will be specified shortly. Configuration 2. The Savonius rotor. The vertical mechanism resembling a bisected steel drum, 2 opposing asymmetrical surfaces, offset on a centralized vertical axis. Sigurd Savonius finalized the engineering in the early 1920s. He secured the patent before the end of that decade. The physics relies on a fundamental fluid dynamic, aerodynamic drag. The atmospheric pressure exerts superior kinetic force on the concave surface compared to the convex profile. The localized pressure differential initiates rotation. The identical physics dictate the anemometer cups on a standard weather station. The Savonius configuration does not maximize thermodynamic extraction. It possesses 3 mechanical advantages. It initiates rotation at minimum atmospheric velocity. It requires 0 directional orientation. It omits the tail structure. It omits the mechanical yaw bearing. It generates negligible acoustic output. It operates at low rotational velocity. It is nearly impervious to structural failure. It requires a specific application. It extracts localized water. It maintains charge equilibrium in small lead-acid cells. It operates on a roof in a turbulent municipal zone, where fluid dynamics dictate swirling vortices rather than linear kinetic streams. For these specific parameters, the Savonius is absolute. Configuration 3. The Darrieus rotor. The geometry mimics an elliptical curve rotating on a vertical plane. A French engineer named Georges Darrieus registered the United States patent in exactly 1931. The physics deviate entirely from the Savonius model. It abandons aerodynamic drag. It utilizes aerodynamic lift, the precise fluid pressure differential that elevates a commercial aircraft chassis, applied to vertical airfoils, accelerating through a centralized vertical axis. The Darrieus configuration achieves superior thermodynamic efficiency over the Savonius. The extraction coefficients approach the standard tri-blade horizontal units. During the petroleum supply deficits of the 1970s and 1980s, Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico initiated structural testing. They analyzed large-scale Darrieus architectures. They published the foundational engineering data. This exact mathematics dictates modern vertical axis mechanics today. The Darrieus model possesses a documented mechanical failure point. The standard configuration cannot achieve self-starting rotation. The airfoil velocity must reach a critical threshold before the lift coefficient engages. It requires external kinetic input to initiate the rotation cycle. Engineers frequently integrate a microscale Savonius rotor on the shared central shaft. It provides the initial rotational torque. The physics are elegant. The thermodynamic output is substantial. The operational parameters are highly volatile. Configuration 4. The helical vertical turbine. The geometry mimics a double helix structure, spiraling up a centralized vertical mast. This is the immediate engineering evolution of the Darrieus physics. By morphing the vertical airfoils into a continuous helix, fluid dynamicists eliminated two structural deficits simultaneously. The helical rotation guarantees a section of the airfoil constantly intersects the optimal aerodynamic angle of attack. This neutralizes the pulsing mechanical torque. It permits rotational initiation at lower atmospheric velocities. The continuous swept area reduces acoustic disruption. It minimizes harmonic vibration transferring to the structural foundation. This is the specific mechanism installed on modern commercial structures, on maritime vessels, on municipal street lamps during infrastructure pilot studies. It is engineered to absorb atmospheric turbulence. It operates in extreme proximity to biological populations. The raw thermodynamic output will never match a high-elevation horizontal tri-blade unit. It was engineered for a distinct mechanical parameter, extracting measurable electrical current from low-velocity, multidirectional urban vortices, without generating high-decibel acoustic interference, without transferring destructive vibrational resonance into the primary concrete foundation. Configuration 5. The ducted turbine, a rotating aerodynamic mass enclosed within a rigid geometric shroud, a flared structural ring extending behind the primary rotor. The theoretical objective is the manipulation of fluid dynamics. The internal geometry of the shroud artificially accelerates the incoming atmospheric pressure wave. It compresses the fluid velocity through the centralized mechanical throat. The expanding rear profile generates an artificial low-pressure void. This induces a continuous aerodynamic draft. The technical classification is a diffuser-augmented turbine. A compact rotor operating within an engineered shroud theoretically extracts the kinetic equivalent of a massive, unshielded mechanism. The theoretical physics are structurally sound. Commercial engineering entities have pursued the specific fluid dynamics for decades. The physics collide with absolute economic constraints. The shroud structure generates massive static weight. The material acquisition cost is high. The entire reinforced assembly requires a heavy-duty yaw mechanism to track the incoming velocity vector. The marginal thermodynamic gains fail to offset the baseline capital expenditure for a residential foundation. This is categorized as a high-efficiency consumer solution. It is not a consumer solution. It is an economic miscalculation. This specific architecture achieves maximum efficiency within simulated thermodynamic software. It achieves maximum efficiency on laboratory load sensors. It demonstrates absolute structural failure in a standard residential deployment. Every mechanism analyzed intersects a strict physical absolute. It is the defining mathematical parameter in this sequence. In exactly 1919, German physicist Albert Betz formalized an absolute thermodynamic boundary. No rotational mechanism can bypass it. No future architecture will bypass it. A localized extraction geometry cannot harvest more than exactly 59.3% of the kinetic energy intersecting its swept area. Physicists define this. The Betz limit. The fluid dynamics dictate a strict mechanical outcome. If a rotor absorbed 100% of the kinetic energy, the atmospheric mass would cease velocity entirely. It would halt directly behind the trailing edge. Static atmospheric mass creates an absolute blockage. The incoming velocity vector would collide with a static pressure wall. The aerodynamic flow jams. A mandatory percentage of the atmospheric mass must maintain forward velocity. It must exit the localized system. Betz derived the exact thermodynamic maximum. Wusherjo, 3%. No commercial vendor alters this. No patent application overrides it. Functional, real-world mechanical units achieve exactly 40 to 50% kinetic extraction. The structurally accurate manufacturers publish this precise data. Memorize this parameter. Wusherjo, 3%. The physics applied in 1919. The physics applied today. This absolute ceiling redefines commercial interactions. A localized vendor promising unlimited electron flow from a minimal geometric box is not selling applied mechanics. They are selling an economic fiction. The structural analysis dictates an immediate data transfer. We are at the midpoint of the mechanical breakdown. You now possess the precise variables most biological observers ignore. You comprehend the localized generation parameters. You hold superior thermodynamic data to the standard consumer entering a retail energy facility. The 6 architectural configurations. The strict division between aerodynamic lift and localized drag. The absolute mathematical ceiling governing the entire kinetic system, recognizing the geometric structures does not equate to physical deployment. You require the specific operational protocols. You must size the mechanism. You must site the foundation. You must vertically elevate the heavy mass above your specific terrestrial coordinates. It requires precise velocity minimums. It requires exact elevation clearances to bypass the turbulent fluid layers near the terrestrial surface. It requires precise load capacities for the lead-acid cells. It requires exact voltage thresholds for the charge controller. It requires specific copper gauge wiring. It requires municipal authorization. It requires spatial zoning compliance. Minor engineering deficits generate massive capital loss. I compiled the absolute mechanical data, every structural measurement, every voltage threshold, the exact sequential deployment parameters, a singular, zero-friction manual, no theoretical fluff, no commercial exploitation. To initiate a thermodynamic localized system, start at that absolute baseline. Configuration 6. This architecture fractures the standard mechanical parameters. The bladeless mast. The terminology is absolute. It possesses 0 aerodynamic airfoils, 0 rotational mass, 0 visible kinetic spinning. It is a vertical cylinder. It is physically anchored to a concrete foundation. When the atmospheric pressure wave intersects the structure, it does not rotate. It oscillates. It sways on a linear axis. Vortex Bladeless in Madrid engineered the primary iteration. The structural testing began in exactly 2014. The applied mechanics isolate a highly specific fluid dynamic. It is the identical physical parameter that induces catastrophic structural failure in reinforced concrete. Atmospheric velocity intersects a static geometric column. The fluid stream shears into alternating vortices of low-pressure voids. First on the left vector, then the right vector. Fluid dynamicists define this exact sequence. Vortex shedding. The alternating pressure voids exert lateral kinetic force. The structure moves. If the frequency of the fluid vortex aligns perfectly with the natural oscillation frequency of the static mast, the kinetic energy compounds, the structural deflection multiplies. Physicists define this. Resonance. It is the exact mechanical overload that obliterated the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in exactly 1940. The bladeless mechanism isolates that catastrophic resonance. It applies the destructive oscillation parameters intentionally. It translates the lateral sway into continuous electron flow. A localized alternator rests at the base plate. The mechanical advantages are strict. 0 airfoils generates near zero acoustic output. It eliminates avian impact vectors. It minimizes the physical deterioration of moving components. The maintenance requirement drops. The structural deficit is mathematical. The kinetic extraction falls significantly below an equivalent vertical tri-blade unit. The technology remains strictly developmental. It is a localized engineering experiment. It is not an optimized kinetic appliance. The mechanical theory demands inclusion. It maps the forward vector of applied fluid dynamics. I will not misrepresent the structural reality. It will not power your localized grid tomorrow. The mechanical baseline is now established. 6 distinct geometries: the horizontal tri-blade, the Savonius, the Darrieus, the continuous helix, the ducted rotor, the oscillating mast. We shift to absolute operational variables. The structural questions dictate the physical outcome. The exact inquiries submitted by localized operators. Question 1. Do your localized coordinates possess adequate fluid velocity? This is the specific boundary where localized generation attempts fail. This parameter separates applied mechanics from commercial deception. The kinetic energy within an atmospheric wave does not scale linearly. It scales cubically. Multiply the wind velocity by a factor of 2. The potential electron extraction multiplies by exactly 8. The variance between a 10 mile per hour coordinate and a 15 mile per hour coordinate is not marginal. It is an absolute mathematical rupture. The United States Department of Energy publishes the strict thermodynamic thresholds. A localized residential mechanism requires a specific baseline, an annual sustained velocity of 10 to 14 miles per hour, exactly 5 meters per second. Any lower velocity renders the mechanical deployment obsolete. You exist in a geographical depression. Your coordinates are shielded by localized topography and biological growth. The atmospheric wave is static. Fluid dynamics will not generate your electron flow. A localized photovoltaic array is the mathematically superior alternative. An isolated mechanical operator published a strict assessment. Human biologicals severely overestimate their localized fluid velocity. They severely under-engineer their vertical mass structure. They attribute the thermodynamic failure to the kinetic mechanism. The assessment is an absolute fact. The engineered geometry rarely malfunctions. The physical site deployment induces the failure. This mandates an analysis of the vertical structural tower. It is the exact mechanical parameter omitted from commercial documentation. Atmospheric velocity near the terrestrial surface is compromised. It operates at low speeds. It fractures into turbulent vortices upon striking biological mass, synthetic fencing, and localized structures. Clean, high-velocity, high-density kinetic waves exist exclusively at higher elevations. The Department of Energy defines the minimum spatial clearance. A functional extraction mechanism requires strict vertical dominance, exactly 30 feet of elevation above any physical obstruction within a 500-foot radial zone. This explains the historical engineering deployment. The original Jacobs mechanisms operated atop massive steel lattice structures. They were not bolted to agricultural timber frames. An aerodynamic rotor on an inadequate vertical mast in a turbulent fluid zone is categorized as an aesthetic addition. It is not an aesthetic addition. It is a kinetic failure. The identical rotational mass on an engineered lattice structure becomes a localized power plant. The vertical mast is not the secondary mechanical component. The vertical mast is the entire structural endeavor. Question 2. Acoustic output. Will the localized decibel generation overload the biological receptors of adjacent populations? The exact outcome depends on the architectural geometry and the specific airfoil tip velocity. A high-velocity tri-blade mechanism generates a rhythmic acoustic pulse. Specific human nervous systems habituate to the frequency in exactly 7 days. Other biological observers process the sound as an infinite mechanical intrusion. The low-velocity vertical axes function differently. The Savonius and the continuous helix emit a heavily reduced acoustic signature. The oscillating bladeless mast approaches 0 decibels. Spatial proximity to adjacent biologicals requires strict mechanical calculation. It represents the primary vector for localized friction. It escalates to municipal legal action. Question 3. The capital expenditure. The economic metrics must be explicitly stated. This data stream rejects theoretical economics. A micro-scale aerodynamic rotor. The mechanical descendants of the historical wind charger variants. The acquisition cost remains mathematically minimal, exactly a few $100s. It provides sufficient electron flow to maintain optical illumination and localized radio transceivers. The wind charger company provides the historical baseline. Founded by the Albers brothers in Sioux City, Iowa. The year was exactly 1927. They manufactured simple 6-volt mechanical units. The acquisition cost was exactly $15. They integrated the physical mechanism with Zenith radio receivers. The objective was localized audio data transmission outside the centralized grid. That minimum economic parameter is absolute. The parameters scale violently for total residential generation. A heavy mass kinetic rotor. An engineered vertical steel lattice. The subterranean concrete foundation. The continuous voltage inverter. The localized lead-acid chemical array. The required municipal permits. A structurally sound mechanical assembly. This constitutes a multi-$1,000 capital transfer. A massive 10-kilowatt mechanism demands an investment scaling into exactly 5 figures. The geometric extraction device remains the lowest economic variable. The vertical mast. The massive copper wiring gauges. The specialized physical labor. These components consume the capital. A commercial entity suppressing this economic reality is operating against your localized survival. Question 4. The mechanical duration. This parameter validates the kinetic extraction model. The original Jacobs mechanisms maintained continuous rotation for exactly 30 to 40 years. The baseline physics are structurally minimal. A rotating mass. A magnetic generator. Steel ball bearings. A directional tail fine. There is zero carbon combustion. Zero continuous fuel injection. Nothing chemically exotic. It requires standard friction mitigation. It requires conductive brush replacement. It requires visual inspection of the aerodynamic surfaces. It requires tension checks on the vertical mast cables. And engineered turbine functions for decades. That is the exact mathematical objective. It is also the specific commercial failure. A localized mechanism that operates for exactly 40 years without generating an invoice is an economic disaster. It is a disaster if your centralized utility sells continuous electron flow by the month. This is the suppressed mechanical timeline, the specific chronological sequence from exactly 1920 to 1945. Hundreds of thousands of American agricultural coordinates extracted kinetic power. Centralized utility operators calculated the spatial distances between biological units. They analyzed the material acquisition costs. Stringing heavy copper wire to a localized dirt road yielded a negative economic coefficient. They abandoned the spatial zones. The rural sectors remained in absolute zero illumination. The human operators engineered a mechanical response. They installed localized wind chargers. They assembled parallel banks of lead-acid chemical batteries. They achieved structural independence. Then the federal parameter shifted. In exactly 1935 and 1936, the United States government established the Rural Electrification Administration. The physical reality requires absolute precision. The REA initiated a massive structural deployment. It distributed continuous electron flow to isolated biological units. It elevated the baseline living parameters. The consequence was absolute. The REA deployed heavily subsidized copper transmission lines. The localized wind charger manufacturing sector collapsed entirely. Almost instantly, a human operator will not perform friction mitigation on a vertical turbine. A human operator will not maintain chemical battery equilibrium. Not when heavily subsidized. Continuous grid voltage terminates directly at the property line. Within exactly 15 years, the Jacobs infrastructure vanished. The entire manufacturing ecosystem dissolved. Not due to a mechanical deficit. The physics remained intact. The localized systems were overwritten. They were overwritten by a subsidized, metered transmission model. The moment the copper wire penetrated the residential structure, the parameter became permanent. You ceased mechanical generation. You initiated infinite capital transfer. Every motorized appliance was re-engineered. It required a standardized wall outlet. It required the centralized grid. It required the external electrical meter rotating on the exterior wall. This is categorized as technological progress. It is not technological progress. It is the absolute centralization of a commercial dependency. There is zero infinite revenue in a machine purchased once. A machine that extracts kinetic energy for exactly 40 years. There is infinite capital accumulation in a copper wire. A wire that extracts monthly currency from the biological operator until physical expiration. The atmospheric pressure wave maintained constant velocity. The mathematical coefficients remained rigid. Albert Betz, exact limit of 50 no. 3% was valid in exactly 1960. It was valid in exactly 1920. We simply terminated the manufacturing sequence. We eliminated the applied physics from standard biological education. The localized map must be drawn. I will not distribute theoretical falsehoods. If you occupy an open terrestrial coordinate, the plains, a geological ridgeline, a coastal boundary, a specific coordinate where the fluid dynamics physically warp the plant growth, where the atmospheric velocity is continuous. If you possess the spatial clearance for a vertical mast, the optimal structural selection is a tri-blade horizontal turbine, the direct mechanical descendant of the Jacobs parameters. It possesses the maximum aerodynamic efficiency coefficient. If your coordinates are municipal, a residential roof, operating inside a turbulent, fragmented fluid stream, in extreme proximity to other human operators, the vertical axis geometries are mandatory. The Savonius rotor provides absolute structural durability. It initiates at minimum kinetic velocity. The continuous helical rotor offers a superior thermodynamic compromise. It suppresses acoustic output. It outperforms a massive, high-decibel horizontal mechanism that induces auditory distress. If the required parameter is a microvoltage trickle charge, to maintain lead-acid equilibrium in an isolated structure or maritime vessel, a localized aerodynamic drag unit mimics the historical windcharger model. It requires minimal capital. It survives severe structural stress. The diffuser-augmented turbine remains an engineered failure against baseline economics. The oscillating bladeless mast operates as a theoretical prototype. It is not an optimized load-bearing mechanism. Do not sequence your grid to it. If your physical coordinate exists in a static atmospheric zone, shielded by topography, the mechanical advice is absolute. Terminate the wind parameters. Deploy a localized photovoltaic array. The mechanism strictly functions where the fluid dynamics exist. There is zero mechanical bypass for this thermodynamic reality. The structural safety parameters are absolute. This is not a casual biological exertion. You are vertically elevating a massive mechanical object, exactly dozens of feet above the terrestrial surface. It operates under immense aerodynamic load. It contains rapidly rotating physical mass. It conducts high-voltage direct current. It terminates in a chemical battery array, a localized array capable of delivering a fatal electrical discharge. Vertical masts undergo catastrophic collapse when tension cables fail. Biological operators expire during vertical ascension. Atmospheric electrical discharge seeks elevated metallic structures. It dictates absolute copper grounding protocols. The sequence requires certified engineering tolerances. It requires municipal authorization. It requires specific spatial setbacks. It demands a specialized technician for the localized grid integration. It demands a specialized technician for the vertical mast elevation. Calculate the risks identically to the historical operators. They did not exhibit biological fear of the mechanisms. They simply respected the absolute physical limits. The analysis returns to the initial coordinate. A residential parcel in Cleveland. The year exactly 1887. Charles Brush observed a rotational mass. Exactly 17 meters of cedar airfoils. It converted atmospheric velocity into localized optical illumination. Zero external billing. Zero centralized authorization. Zero commercial entities intercepting the physical fluid stream. He executed the applied physics before the standard grid existed. The structural proof was absolute. For exactly 60 years, the operators understood the kinetic extraction parameters. The engineers who manufactured the mechanisms. Charles Brush. Paul Lacour in Denmark. Marcellus Jacobs in Minnesota. The Albers brothers in Iowa. They were not theoretical idealists. They were structural engineers. Their localized machines maintained continuous rotation. The physics were never destroyed. They were deliberately withheld from commercial distribution. The data is now transferred. The superior mechanical data is frequently the historical baseline. The atmospheric pressure wave belongs to zero commercial entities. The copper wire belongs to the centralized utility. Analyze your spatial coordinates. Evaluate your local boundary. Observe the singular thermodynamic variable. When you stand on the terrestrial surface, does the atmospheric mass physically travel? Does the kinetic velocity deform the biological structures? Do the synthetic flags achieve horizontal tension? Or is the fluid dynamic entirely static? That absolute physical data point dictates the mechanical deployment. It supersedes any commercial documentation. If your genetic predecessors operated an agricultural wind charger before the centralized copper wire deployment, if historical memory retains the image of a subterranean array, a sequence of glass-cased lead-acid batteries, that structural history is the absolute archive. The subsequent transmission isolates those subterranean glass batteries. The abandoned chemical storage parameter that powered the agricultural sectors The specific lead-acid equilibrium, the exact reason an infinitely repairable chemical cell was eradicated. Replaced by a sealed polymer enclosure you are legally forbidden to disassemble. The atmospheric pressure wave maintains constant velocity. The kinetic energy is absolute. The only variable that shifted, the centralized entities convinced you the physics were obsolete.